This is the Westside King's Church podcast, where we aim to encounter and embody the surprising grace of Jesus.
Well, David, for the sake of time,
Yep.
And content wise, I wonder if we don't get started. I'll watch for others. If they do forget that they were, if they are barbecuing and forget and come in, I'll watch and I can let them in as we get going here. But when we get started,
Yeah, it's there was an old British TV show and it used to always begin with, I'm talking really old, it's like a kid's show my dad used to watch. We used to watch reruns when I was a kid, but it always started with, "Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin." So there's a kind of niche British joke there that's completely lost on my current my current context, but I figured it's a place to start, right?
Yeah. So on that note, why don't we get started?
So we're talking this evening and for the next couple of weeks about resurrection, and it's a big subject. We're teaching on it on our Sunday teaching program, this series called Download at the moment. We're trying to wrestle through, what does the resurrection really mean? But one of the things I wanted to sort of pull away and chat about a little bit in this kind of short circle. There's a variety of things we want to talk about, Tyson, and I'm open to hearing more thoughts from people about what we should be talking about would be helpful. But for me, one of the questions you kind of almost want to have to deal with and want to talk about is this question about, if the resurrection's so important, right? If, which yes, we're saying it is. If the resurrection, which is like important clarification right at the start, if the resurrection of Jesus is important, do we as Christians need to deal with the kind of elephant in the room? I think that's the phrase that we use, isn't it? Which is like, did it actually happen? Like, is it
right?
It's like, let's just step for a moment and say, we're talking about our whole faith hanging on the notion and the idea that somebody died and came back to life again, right? And so there's a variety of ways that some people have come in and tried to navigate, try to navigate a little bit differently as to how, maybe it didn't really happen. Maybe it's more metaphorical. Maybe it's a sort of spiritual story that's being told to us, and we need to just kind of see through that. And so there's this kind of perhaps way of dealing with it goes, it's just something we say about Easter. And then, of course, we come out with a series like we're teaching on Sundays at the moment and are sort of saying, actually, not only did it happen, but actually all of our faith kind of hangs on it happening. So do we need to turn around and deal with the obvious thing of, if you could go back in time in a time machine, right, with a video camera and set it up pointing at the tomb, right? Would it record something happening on that Easter, on that first Easter morning? And I just think it's really important to ask those questions, Tyson. I think it's okay as Christians to ask those questions. I think it's important to actually ask those questions and to deal firsthand with the question of, before we even get to the theological implications of it, is it real? Where do you stand on something like that?
Yeah, and I think, we've done we've had some conversations on doubt. So I think the questioning piece isn't, if anyone's participated in those conversations with us would know we're okay to ask the questions. They're actually good things to ask, and I think it's a common thing. I think you're right. I think it's really easy for us to come to Easter. It happens every year. We talk about, Jesus on the cross on Good Friday, resurrection on Sunday, and then we kind of move on with our lives. And it can come and go so quickly that sometimes we don't always stop to think about, actually everything, our entire faith does hang in the balance with this stuff. And Paul picks up on this. In 1 Corinthians 15, which you touched on in your message this past Sunday, as kind of a launching pad for the series that we're working through, where Paul really says, hey, if the resurrection didn't happen, think about all of the implications of that. Like that is really what Paul is saying. If Christ was not raised, then we're in a world of trouble.
Yes.
World of trouble, because absolutely everything else crumbles around it. There's no other way. Right? Like that is the simple reality is, if it's not true, Paul says you're to be pitied. Right? That is what he says. You probably know the actual, original language. I'm just going to speak in English, but he that's what he essentially says. He says you are to be pitied.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually very, very interesting, because there is, and I don't know everybody's familiarity with this, but there's two or three schools of thought go on out there. Now, there's one school of thought which sort of says this is all made up and nonsense, so why are you even talking about it? So let's put that to one side just for the moment, because that's a different whole subject to talk about, right? But what about Christians themselves, right? And you kind of see two categories of Christians. I'm noticing. So you have one category of Christian that goes, no, the resurrection is 100% real, and it happened. So that's one category. Then you get another category of Christian who goes, no, I don't think it physically happened. I think more it has symbolic meaning or metaphorical meaning, or what we read the early Christians to have said isn't what we now think that to have mean. So, and this goes back, I mean, you see these sort of ideas developing, 250 years ago in Western critical scholarship, this sort of notion of, people just wrote differently back then. So, you would find, now these ideas, there's a lot of kind of big scholarly names that you can kind of cite doing it. One that's kind of perhaps amongst the most famous is a German scholar named Rudolf Boltmann, who wrote in the kind of 1930s and around that sort of period. And he was heavily influenced by another German philosopher, Martin Heidegger. Boltmann was a really, really good Christian. Heidegger was a horrendous man. And I know that, like, there's horrendous philosophers, and then there's Heidegger, fully paid up member of the Nazi party type horrendous, right? So, but Boltmann was fascinated in a really ironic way, because Boltmann, helped, smuggle Jewish people out of Germany, and yet was fascinated by the work of Heidegger, who Heidegger's philosophy read ancient works, and what he did was this program called Demythologizing. And so Heidegger would read, ancient, stories, and he would say, okay, listen, in those days, everybody knew that this didn't happen, but it was just an ancient way of talking that you kind of filled out stories with all this sort of mythological language. And you essentially, the average reader knew that this guy wasn't really a hero. He was just a very, very good soldier or something like that. Does that make sense, Tyson? And so, a classic example would be the story of Achilles, right? Achilles, the great sort of Roman or great Greek, the great Greek hero. And then the story of Achilles says that when he was young, somebody dipped him in some magic water, and therefore he was invincible, right? And but the place where they were holding his ankle when they dipped him in the water, that space there wasn't invincible. And of course, that was what we now call the Achilles tendon, right? And now, so Heidegger would read something like that, and he would say, well, clearly Achilles was just a very, very good soldier, right? And this rumor develops around him. Or, actually more likely, Heidegger would say, they just told the story with this mythological language to increase the appeal and the heroic status of Achilles. But anybody reading it in that time period would know, he was just a really good soldier, right? What's interesting is, if you watch Troy, the recent Hollywood movie, I say recent, 15 years ago.
I was going to say it's not that recent anymore, but
when you're talking about stories that were written 300 BC, 15 years ago is recent, right? So, and so, it's all relative, isn't it? And so if you actually look at the way they told that story there, they didn't mention anything about Achilles being invincible. So they actually borrowed this way of actually reading the story. So Boltmann comes along and he goes, "Wow, this is fascinating." He was really struggling. So he was pastoring and studying and lecturing ultimately in very kind of modernist liberal Germany. And so when he goes to the bar to talk to people about Jesus, the moment he gets to the miraculous stuff, he loses everybody, right? So Boltmann thinks, well, maybe what I can do is take Heidegger's approach and apply it to the New Testament, right? And so he starts this whole kind of field of, really develops, rather, he doesn't start, but really develops this field of what they call demythologizing the New Testament. So he would say, when we come to the resurrection of Jesus, everybody knows that dead people don't rise from the dead, including people in the first century, right? So this is kind of mythological language that we must ignore, read through to get to the heart of the message. And Boltmann sort of believed that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, but instead the message of the gospel was kind of continued through, through the church, this message of hope and peace and everything like this. And this mode of thinking has become increasingly, well, it's ridden waves of popularity. So It was a really kind of successful movement in the 30s, and then the kind of mess of the Second World War convinced everybody it was a pretty bad way of thinking, actually, because one of the significant problems with the sort of whole demythologizing approach is you lose the sort of Jewish roots of Jesus a little bit. And obviously, post-Second World War, anything smelling of anti-Semitism was wisely and correctly sort of ignored. But it's sort of come back 2 or 3 times. And then you get modern scholars like Marcus Borg, Bart Ehrman, Dominic Crossan, people like this that have kind of continued to push this idea as a way of thinking. And it becomes quite popular amongst certain groups of Christianity because they go, this maybe helps me. I don't need to believe all that difficult stuff. Right. I can just believe the message of Jesus instead of actually what happened, right? So sorry for that hugely long introduction there. But the problem you've got with it, as a lot of other scholars will tell you, is exactly the moment when you get to Paul, right? Where Paul doesn't seem to want to let you off with the idea that this is just a metaphor about some sort of better way of living. Would you say that's fair to say?
I would agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. And so the problem you've got is 2 things. If we're going to go down the route of, well, there's way more than 2 things actually, and more will come out. I'll do that thing in the Proverbs where you say 2 things and then list 3 or 4. But the challenge you have is that if the Bible writers knew that Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, and instead they were talking about the resurrection of a message of hope, for example, there's a couple of things that all of the New Testament writers do that makes it really awkward. The way they just talk about it. The gospel writers all seem to talk as if eyewitnesses actually saw him, right? Paul, not only does he talk about the fact that eyewitnesses actually saw him, but he then does what you've said just there. He actually corners people into a sort of space and says, no, you actually really have to accept this in order for the whole thing to make sense. The other thing gets forgotten all the time, Tyson, is that people in the ancient world knew that when you died, you were dead. This is not new knowledge.
But that is a legitimate argument that you will hear from some people.
Yes.
They will go, well, actually, we have way more knowledge in modern science.
Yes.
And so people back then, they just didn't have any understanding of how the world worked and how things worked. And it's just not true. They also knew that when someone died, they died.
There's a brilliant interview between Tom Wright, a favorite scholar of yours and mine, and Gert Thiessen, a brilliant New Testament scholar as well, although I would disagree with him on a lot of stuff. But and they're talking about resurrection, and Thiessen gets really frustrated with Tom at one point and kind of gets a little irate and says, Tom, like we have 200 years of modern scientific evidence that shows that dead people don't rise from the dead. And Tom goes, so I can show you 2,000 years of literature that tell you that people believe that dead people don't rise from the dead. It's not that Jesus came back and everybody went, oh, hello, you're back. We wondered when you would come back. You've been to enough funerals in the ancient world. You know how this works, right? You don't need to be a scientific expert. But I think a lot of these ideas are rooted actually not in 1 Corinthians 15, but actually in what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, which is that the problem is this idea is offensive. The gospel requires you to redefine what you think is possible. And that's really what Tom Wright's point is. It's not that, people believed anything back in the olden days and now we're cleverer. This is this kind of myth of progress that we'll talk about throughout this teaching series on Sundays, that, we're getting smarter so we know better. The resurrection is ludicrous, right? In terms of, scientific provability. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't think seriously about it as a historical event, because there are many things which are ludicrous scientifically, but historians will tell you it only needs to happen once to be a historical moment. Scientists will tell you, and I'm not anti-science, Tyson. I always want to make that point. I think my problem is when people try to use science to make historical points, right? So there's all these moments in history, from sports moments right down to like let me tell you a soccer one for a moment. I know that nobody relates to soccer, but there's this famous moment in English soccer where it was a really tense game. Paul Gascoigne, one of the great English players, he was running in towards the goal. The ball was crossed across the front of him. And if you watch the highlights to this day, even when you know what's going to happen, how he manages to not score is just one of the most remarkable pieces of sports history ever, right? He somehow misses the most easy goal ever for a man of his quality. And I watched a program once where this scientist had calculated that there was something like a 1 in 1,000 chance that he miss. So if you were to take that again, 999 times you'd score the goal. Here's the problem. He didn't score the goal, right? So scientific probability tells us that there's a 1 in 1,000 chance he misses. Well, hey, guess what? He missed. So I'm not anti-science, but my problem is when science comes across and says, no, that can't happen because we can't replicate it in a lab. And the problem is that history is the story of a whole ton of stuff that only ever happened once. So we've got to be careful of defining history. You're a golfer. A hole-in-one is a classic example. The chances of hitting a hole-in-one, the variables that are involved in getting a hole-in-one.
Never had one. Never had one yet. I'm still hoping.
But they happen, though. They happen, don't they?
But they happen. Yeah. And I find that interesting, and maybe we start to unpack this. But I find that when it comes to things like science and people's critique of the resurrection and the biblical narrative, and they hold the biblical narrative and the resurrection story to a different standard per se. Standard might not be the perfect word to use, that they don't always hold to other situations or other ancient pieces of literature and texts. And because when you start to, and maybe we start to go here, but when you start to look at the biblical narratives of how close to the actual event they're written, how many eyewitnesses, when it was published, were there other people that could have technically said, this isn't true, right? When you put those on paper and start to list those details around other ancient literature that people would say, well, of course those things happen, and of course those things are real. The biblical narrative, is head and shoulders above in a lot of ways certain texts that no one seems to even bat an eye at. Yet you're right, there is
definitely
so offensive to the point that they go, well, I'm willing to ignore all of that stuff because no, right? Like that's as good of an answer as they get. Well, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's a couple of stories come to mind for me. One, again, based in my Scottishness, although it's not going to be another football story. So that was my one
Please
and
tell
only
me it's
football story.
Braveheart. Please tell
It
me it's
is Braveheart, right? Okay,
Yes, I'm in. I'm in.
So this is a piece of established Scottish history that at one point, Stirling, which is a city about 7 or 8 miles away from where I grew up, where I was born, rather. Who knows where I grew up? But there's this town called Stirling, and what happened was the English armies, a vastly more experienced, skilled, and armed military force, moved on the town of Stirling to try and occupy it. And William Wallace and essentially a very small group of people went down to face off the army. And, now as Scots people, we tell as Wallace is a piece of kind of military genius. It was probably more chance than anything else. But Wallace chose to defend the town of Stirling basically at a bridge, and it became known as the Battle of Stirling Bridge. It's one of the first battles that you encounter in Braveheart. And essentially, if you run the stats on that, the chances of Wallace's army beating the English army that day are non-existent. But because of the place they chose to fight, again, not dissimilar to the 300 Spartans when they were fighting in another famous story that made it to movies, by fighting in a narrow spot, you basically remove the advantage your enemy has of their superior power. And this is a piece of Scottish history. Like we learn it in schools. They take us on tours of where it happened. It's over 1,000. Well, it's coming up for 1,000 years ago, if I remember my history correctly, which I probably don't. And it's coming up for 1,000 years ago, and there's very little actual evidence of it, right? But we tell it as if it actually happened. Then you go back to the Spartans. Again, this story, the 300 Spartans, is a piece of Roman, Greco-Roman, ancient Mediterranean history. And again, very, very little evidence for it. So two really unlikely stories with very, very little actual evidence for it. And we kind of just accept those as true stories, right? And sure, they've been elaborated on over years, but they're taken as true. Then you come to the New Testament, right? And we kind of deal with it, Tyson, on a sort of zero-sum level. Did it happen or did it not happen? Well, it doesn't sound like the sort of thing that could happen, so therefore it didn't happen, right? But actually, let's just step back there for a couple of moments. There's a few things that I would want to jump in on and sort of say right there, but maybe you've got some comments. I don't want to cut you off because I feel like I'm doing all the talking here.
No, you jump in and then we'll get rolling.
All right. So the first thing, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, in the series on Sundays as well. The first thing for me is language. Okay.
Yeah.
So briefly, let's just describe it like this: the ancient world, or like the world at the time of Jesus and Paul and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, had a very vibrant belief systems about what happened when people died, right? Yeah. Because once again, when people knew in the ancient world, when you died, you were dead. And because a lot of people died, everybody died. But because people died regularly and you were always in the face of death, attrition rates were high. You get this strong developing theories about afterlife, and you see them all over the place. And so as a result of that, as is the case in any culture, when you talk about something a lot, people become very precise in how they talk about things, right? So, the story that you see quite regularly, cultures that have a lot of snow have a lot of different language to describe the different types of snow that you get. Cultures that don't have a lot of snow, they just have snow, right? And because, we don't need to deal with it very much, so we do. So again, the world where there was a lot of beliefs around the ancient world, there's very precise ways of how you can talk about it. And so if you were in a bar or in the marketplace in ancient, Rome or ancient Greece, and you heard somebody talking about life after death, or what happens when you die, let's use that as a better term. If you were to pay attention to how they talked about it, you could probably locate who they were in terms of their belief or religion. because how they talked about it would help you plot them on the spectrum, if that makes sense. Now, we have a tendency to forget that in the contemporary world, Tyson. So what we do is we basically take any language at all that seems to have something to do with what happens when you die, and we basically just put it all in the same bucket and treat them like they're synonyms. So, and actually, ironically enough, this is what the modern scholars are doing when they start saying, "Wow, Jesus' resurrection was more of a resurrection to faith, etc." And all this sort of stuff. Resurrection was a decidedly Jewish belief. You do see it a little bit, but it's hard to date it precisely in Zoroastrianism. Right. So it's kind of like, maybe, but maybe that's not our time. That might come later. It's not kind of overly clear. But it's a Jewish and a very specific group of Jewish people that believed in bodily resurrection as God's plan for the world. And then the Christians took this and upheld it as their process as well. So this is quite interesting because a couple of things it tells. Number one, if you're going to fake something, okay, you're picking a very specific point on the spectrum to fake it. Okay.
Yes.
If the disciples wanted to go, oh, well, Jesus got killed, we didn't really expect that to happen. And now nobody's going to believe our story, but we need to keep, and there literally has been scholars have suggested this, but we need to keep our living going because we've got a kind of tidy gig here going around talking about the kingdom of God. So what we'll do is we'll pretend that Jesus has come back. Now, what I think and a response to that would be is, well, there's a whole host of things they could have done. They could have said, well, Jesus has come back to us as a spirit. Jesus has come back to us in ghost-like form. Jesus has now transcended into heaven and guides us, and all of a sudden people go, okay, you're that type of group, no worries. And some people would be on board and some people wouldn't be on board. But if the disciples were faking it, they chose a very specific language, right? And that language was the language of bodily resurrection. They located themselves in a very specific group of thinking in order to do that. And then the burden of proof lay upon them now to basically go about. So when they say we believe Jesus has been resurrected, a guy in a Jerusalem bar, if you'll forgive the metaphor, but a guy in a Jerusalem bar doesn't think to himself, oh, you mean that the message of Jesus is now continuing to live on in all those who preach it? No, he's not thinking that. And he's not thinking, oh, you mean Jesus has returned to heaven forever as a spirit. Because you said resurrection, the guy in the bar knows what you're saying you think has happened. Now, he might not believe you, but you've stated what you're saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. And well, I shouldn't say of course. It makes sense for me because you and I are spending a lot of time studying this right now for the series that we're doing. But don't forget that also the people who start the story are women.
Yes.
Which we can read now and say, oh, isn't that lovely, right? That, Mary is like, they're there and they start telling the disciples, but culturally, this is, they're not counted as a legitimate witness in anything.
Yes.
Like anything
100%.
that went to court, you can't have a woman testify in that time. They would go, no, we don't listen to to the stories. And it sounds terrible, but that's the reality.
So first problem is if the disciples are faking this, they choose a really awkward way to describe what they're faking.
Beyond awkward.
Yes, when they could significantly choose an easier one, right? So that's one problem. Second problem is now that let's just go with this for a second. A really good conversation with two pastors. Let's assume it's all faked, right? And let's talk through how that process goes. Okay.
Sure.
So now that they've decided they're faking a story, right?
Yes.
They decide, well, let's tell the story like this. Let's tell the story that the women went down to the tomb and they saw Jesus, right? So exactly as you say, I don't say this is the behavior that I would want to have, but in a patriarchal first century context, they basically choose the worst possible witnesses, to defend it, because people go, well, that doesn't even stand up in court. Now, what's really interesting, I'm going to have to choose my words very carefully here. because Paul gets accused of being a chauvinist all the time, and I don't believe he is. But in Corinth, in 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul lists through all the people who have seen the resurrected Jesus, but he does it in a legal manner. So if you look at Paul's form, it feels like he's making a defense case for the resurrection. Okay. What's really interesting to note is he doesn't mention any of the women. Okay. And I think the reason he does that is because he's building a kind of almost legal defense for the resurrection. Mentioning the women doesn't strengthen his case, because the listener would go, yeah, but you can't trust the testimony of a woman. Now, Paul, I think, fundamentally believes that's wrong.
Right.
He uses women in his ministry all over the place. Rome get the letter to the Romans because Paul entrusts the letter to a woman. So it's not an insight into Paul. It's an insight into Paul trying to win a legal argument, for want of a better term. So second problem comes along, which is that the first witnesses of the resurrection are not a great. It's a bad way to fake a story, right?
Yeah, terrible. At least within that time frame. Anyways, they've picked something incredibly obscure that no one believes in, really.
Yes.
And again, they've
even we know this. The Sadducees, another Jewish group, don't believe in resurrection. Okay.
Yeah. Please don't share your dad joke. Please.
I won't tell my dad joke about the Sadducees.
Thank you.
But you can Google it.
You'll be sad to see.
That doesn't mean that the Sadducees don't believe in life after death. It just means that they don't believe in resurrection.
Yes, right? Meaning the bodily.
Exactly.
And that's often the misconception, which again we address in our Sunday messages.
Yes, 100%. So this is quite fascinating. So first problem is really awkward choice of terms to use. Second problem is you've got these women as your witnesses. Third problem, if I can keep pushing our problems out there, third problem is of your four resurrection stories that you have in the New Testament. What's one of the big problems with all four of them? I'm putting you on the spot.
Oh,
I'm just
now
curious.
You're putting me on the spot again. The big problem with all four of them.
They don't match up. Right?
Yeah, well, they don't line up.
They're all slightly different. Okay.
Yeah.
Which actually is a good thing. All right. Because if you were going to try and fake a story, then make your stories match up. Right? So simple question. How many angels
the angels
are present at the resurrection story? Yeah. And in Mark, no angels. Okay. So, then you have, you've got all these different takes. Now, I think it's possible to make sense of that, but again, what you actually start to get the emphasis, and a lot of scholars who've done the work on this have pointed this out. This is what actually helps us think that what we're encountering in the resurrection stories of Jesus, it comes across like eyewitness details. It's John's is a classic example. Like in the resurrection story in John's gospel, he gets into this sentence about who ran the fastest. It's like,
which I think is a great flex. I think it's a great flex. If you're going to tell a story about yourself, you let everyone know that you're the faster disciple, always, and the most loved.
It's true. The beloved disciple made it first towards the tomb.
Yeah.
No, it's a nuts point at some level. And with due respect to Scripture, I love Scripture, so hopefully I can get away with just making that slightly inappropriate point. It's a strange point to make unless it is quite literally eyewitness testimony, because eyewitnesses make mention of strange things. They point things up, that where were the clothes lying, and why is that being mentioned, and the fact that it's a young man that comes and announces to them what's happened in Mark's gospel, whereas in other gospels they encounter angels and so on and so forth. So again, the Christian witness could do a much better job if they actually had tried, if they were trying to fake it, get their stories straight.
If you're colluding with someone else, you line up all the details. But it's an interesting thought process when you think about how stories were passed on within the ancient world, right? Because a lot of it was verbal before it was ever kind of written down. And I you and I could take the same story, and we would tell the story differently. Why? because if we were at the same party and someone tripped going up the stairs and we thought it was hilarious, well, we could be on opposite sides of the room.
Really dark insight into the things that you and I find funny there.
Well, sorry, but you know what I mean. Maybe I saw the facial expression and you didn't, right? Because
yes.
why?
Yeah.
Because of where I was located.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden there's different, right? You should have seen the look on their face. Well, actually you should have seen the
way the cup went up in the air.
The vase that shattered that they knocked over that I don't see, right? And how you tell the story shifts slightly within the same room based on just points of emphasis.
Yeah.
I think that's an important piece to remember.
I think it's Francis Watson's book, or is it Richard Balcomb's book? Forgive me. There's a couple of scholars have written books on the Jesus testimonies recently, Francis Watson and Richard Balcomb. I think it's Balcomb who talks about essentially they come across like eyewitness testimony. They have that nuance and that sort of feel to it that this is just what you get when you deal with eyewitness testimony. It's not, and I've talked to cops before who have told me, if you interview a crowd of witnesses and all three of them tell you exactly the same story, that sounds suspicious. There's something fishy going on there, So you've
point of emphasis and perspective.
100%, right? So we're working through this list of problems. Here's another problem that you encounter, is that, I don't know what size you want to put the discipleship group at this point, because the Bible's a little vague, right? At very least, there's 11 men, but there's also a decent connection of women. So let's say there's, somewhere between 11 and 20 people that seem to be connected to the Jesus story very closely at this particular moment. But let's just not forget, like 40 odd days later, there's like 100 of them all in a room in Jerusalem. So the story, it may even be bigger than that. And the bigger that number is, the more problematic what I'm about to say is. But let's just say they're faking the story. And this group of people now go on to start a movement. And it's not until the 2nd century, okay? It's not until the 2nd century that you start to find amongst leaders of Christianity, right? So I'm being very careful with my words here to try and be accurate. Well, let me just say it more easily like this. Amongst the first generation of Christian, leaders, none of them break ranks on the story. Okay, so consistently, the one thing you don't see in early Christianity is the leaders of Christianity going, well, it wasn't really a resurrection; it was a spiritual return to heaven. Right? They have the option. If you're faking the story, why not get a little bit further from Jerusalem and then start telling your own take on it? Right? We know that that's possible. Paul turns up in Corinth. And there's people that are clearly in Corinth going, this sounds a little far-fetched. I don't think we need to believe this bit. And that's what gives us 1 Corinthians 15, right? Paul going, no, you do have to believe this. This is central. But,
right.
There's, like there's an old joke about, you put 10 people in a room and that's how you get 12 opinions, right? So we're supposed to believe that this group of somewhere between 11 and 20 and possibly 100 to 120, if you take the Acts witness, we're supposed to believe that 120 people all got together, faked a story, and nobody broke ranks, even though there were considerably more believable ways to carry on perpetuating this story without resurrection. Paul turns up in Athens in Acts 17, and everybody loves what he has to say. They really like what he's saying about kingdom until he hangs it all in the resurrection, and everybody goes, no, we're out. That's too far-fetched for us, right? Which is just awesome, because like he's in this group of people who believe literally anything. And he goes, no, resurrection. They're like, no, too far.
Now you've pushed our limit.
Yeah. No, so Acts 17 is really fascinating because it gives us that bearing as to how people respond when you do talk about resurrection.
Right. Yeah, and I think you're bang on there when you think about this idea. Like, I've been in enough friends circles to know when you're trying to pull a joke on someone, there's always one person that's like, "Hey, by the way, this is about to happen," or they're like, like they always tell something they're not supposed to.
Hey, you'll see you at your surprise birthday party tonight.
Yeah, and if you don't have that friend, you are that friend. But there's all like, so when you're looking at Jesus appearing to multitudes of people, you've got major implications as far as, if this is not true, how are we going to make sure everyone stays on the same page? Especially because we're all going to travel out, and right, how are we going to keep the story going? And I think, and maybe I'm jumping ahead in some stuff that I know you've got some stuff written down, but when you think about even and maybe I'm backing it up a little bit, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and look at when those were written, when we have, copies of them, 45, 60 years, kind of the earliest after post Jesus, depends on who you talk to, ballpark.
Yeah. Broadly
roughly
speaking, your Gospels are written between sort of 60, 65, depending on where you want to sit, 65, 70, and about 90 or 91. So you got a 30-year window, is about 30 years after Jesus that they become written down. There's a lot of evidence that they were spoken sources before that.
Yes, but when you've got them written down now, when you're looking at historical texts and people are running through all the critiques of that, you're looking at probably one of the tightest windows when it comes to ancient historical texts, if I'm remembering my history correctly. Which means, again, written down, now the story's starting to be passed around. You know that there's someone who's reading it going, did you... If they could read, I guess that's a larger kind of question. But but if they were reading it, going, "Did you hear this story?" and someone going, "Yeah, I was there when they made that up," it didn't fully go with that.
So this is fascinating, Tyson, because you do get. So let's just try and be good historians for a second. You do get this mythological arc, right? It happens. There's you can see it where there's a story. And over time, if you think about it, so here's the story that actually happened. And over time, the story starts to develop and grow and arc. And maybe Achilles is an example of that. We've talked about him already. So we'll stick with the Brad Pitt movie for a little moment, right? There is a true story there somewhere. It does feel like, and it seems like there's something there, or the 300 Spartans. But in the retelling of the story, the mythological elements of the story grow, right? So by the time we get it, you get an almost demigod-like character, that's there. So we know this can happen in the ancient world, that a story can begin true, but develop to become mythological. Here's the problem. It generally takes hundreds of years to happen. Right? It doesn't happen within the lifespan of the people who first saw the story happen, right? So you could maybe, and some people say this, like, oh, stories develop and mythology attaches to them. Yeah, not in 30 years, okay? And that's when it gets written down. Yeah, it's a really tight window. And bearing in mind, actually, it's, sorry, I just yanked my earphone out here. Bear in mind, it's not actually 30 years, because it's 30 years to the beginning of probably 35 years till we get Mark's gospel written down, but it does bear all the evidence of having some sort of oral tradition before that, okay? So even if that's 5 years, let's give Mark 5 years, it's probably longer. Let's give him 5 years, so that's 30 years. But Corinthians is probably dating, around about, in my opinion, kind of mid-50s of the first century. So you're now down into, 25 years, maybe even less, that this sort of story is now developing. Does that make sense? So So you're asking a lot for story development, because you're preaching this story, right? So you turn up somewhere and you go, hey, I got this great story. Somebody goes, well, that didn't happen at all, because I'm related to such and such, and that story's just made up. You can't bring that here, right? So you're really asking for really fast development of the story. Okay, so we're listing our problems here. So can I throw another one in here?
Because there's more. There are a few more.
For me, you've now got another piece to add on to this, right? Which is the first generation of disciples, with the exception of John, all of them were executed. Right?
Yep.
So
This.
So, because of what they claim happened.
Yeah, because of the resurrection, because of
right.
standing by that.
So there is a point where you go, yeah, okay, I made it up. And I would say that point comes way earlier than most of the stuff we see in the New Testament, but it definitely comes earlier than than when you're being burned at the stake or crucified upside down, as tradition
upside
tells us.
down, yeah.
So you're now perpetrating, you're perpetrating this idea that these people made a story up, and then within their lifetime were willing to go to their death over it. Like that's pretty serious at that point. You're talking about Paul probably dying under Nero, and it's recent. It's not like, I just find it difficult to accept. People lie all the time. People make stories up all the time. I just was looking as part of my research for this series. I don't know if you've seen. There's a couple of those sort of stories out there. Heaven is for real, and the boy who went to heaven. And then one of the boys comes out 10 years later as a 16-year-old and says, "Yeah, actually, I made that up. I just kind of thought this is what everybody would want me to say." In 10 years, he managed to keep it a secret for 10 years, and then guilt got the better of him, and he comes out and tells the truth, right? Which, as a brief aside, is quite significant for me, because I had a lot of problems, particularly when that Heaven is for Real film and book came out, because people were sort of trying to read this book as if it was gospel truth. So I'm saying, hey, the Bible doesn't teach that you go for heaven forever. It teaches resurrection, and people are going, well, this little boy died and he went to heaven. And you're kind of going, that's not how we do theology, right?
Yeah, that's a terrible approach to theology.
Yeah, it's true. Like, this popular bestseller replaces biblical theology, But anyway, The point is, we're trying to build an idea that says that these people developed an idea and then went to their deaths to defend something that they themselves made up. Yeah. I find that hard to get my head around.
And there's been the language of, calling them lunatics, and you're saying, really, like, lunatics went to these extents, died for it, and had something, carry out to current today, as far as it's still pushing out, it's still having impact, it's still shaping people's lives and conversations, and right, because there was other people on both sides of Jesus, in history, that had claimed they were messiahs, and they died like the rest of them that they did in Rome, which is what they did with Jesus when they put him on the cross. It was Rome's statement. Like, Rome doesn't want someone coming back to life. That would be the worst thing for Rome ever, because that was a part of their, MO was, we know how to kill people, and we know how to make sure that it's not fun.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing, that all of the Christian history, and you see this even right through into the second generation of Christians, they go to their death because of a confidence in the resurrection, right? Yeah. So death genuinely does lose its fear for them in some sort of sense. So yeah. I mean, the other thing that I think is interesting, James Dunn, brilliant scholar, recently passed away in the UK. He was professor at Durham for many, many years. Dunn points out that another little piece that people don't often pick up on is the lack of any tomb veneration. There was some very specific rules that you go around when it comes to, tombs and burials and all that. As we see, the women are on their way to the tomb on Easter morning to do a very particular thing, right? And there was rules as to how you go about doing that. Generally speaking, what happens as well, when a heroic character dies, you then venerate their tomb. There'd be memorials made to them. There'd be all this sort of stuff. What's fascinating about Christian history is there's just no evidence of anyone doing that. So just think about this through. And we've got to do a little bit of cross-cultural anthropology to just relate to this point, but I think we can do it through metaphor to make the point. So let's think about it like this. How important is a funeral service for us in the contemporary world, right? I would say it's quite important, right?
Right.
It's a tradition for us. Even in a non-religious context, it's a tradition for us that you do this, whether it's cremation or burial, funeral is important, okay? Similarly, the kind of, for the type of character that Jesus was, some sort of, and the things he was claiming to lead and do, some sort of veneration of his tomb, a marking of his tomb, a visiting of his tomb, pilgrimages to his tomb, that would all be kind of classic fare in that time period, right? So if Jesus isn't raised from the dead, so they fake the story. So we've got a long list of things they've just done that have made life difficult for themselves. They're choosing an awkward metaphor of resurrection.
Near impossible.
Yeah, they're holding consistently to the story. They're going to their death for the story. They're insisting that it's the way it's going to be. Also, you have every single one of them, even though they knew it was a fake on the outside, they still loved Jesus. Yet not one of them marked his tomb. Not one of them venerated his tomb. There's no evidence in any Christian history of anybody ever talking about where the tomb of Jesus from Easter Sunday onwards becomes a place of zero significance for the early church. Okay, they don't. By the time we get to the sort of 60s and they're writing down the story, they've got data like he was crucified on a hill called Golgotha. He was, he was at a judge's seat called Gabbatha. These ideas are being told in the story, and all that we know about the tomb is, I think Joseph had a tomb and they put his body in there, right? It's like, right. They don't know where it was. They have no details of it. Like, it seems to me that by 30 years in, nobody can even remember where the tomb was. That's quite significant, actually, because if they were externally faking a story for the benefit of their gig that they were on, you would expect internally at least some tomb veneration, but you just don't get any. It's equivalent to you and me deciding that we will fake a story about our buddy and say he was something significant and that he came back to life. And in order to really live that out, we never bury him, right? And we never have a funeral, and we're okay with that. We just throw the body somewhere of somebody that we loved. And
sounds like Weekend at the Bernie's.
So you get what I'm saying? You're asking these people to completely break with their traditions of burial in order to spoof a story, and somehow again keep that secret also. Yeah, it's kind of tough, So like Dan in his book, he's got a book called Jesus Remembered, like a huge work on analyzing the kind of this whole story of Jesus. And Dan says, so what can you say as a historian, right? So, and this is where you have to be very clever and careful, rather. And please don't hear what I'm not saying when I say this. As a historian, Dan would say, you cannot prove that Jesus raised from the dead. The language of proving is the language of science. Right. And so because you can't prove it, science say it didn't happen. But of course, we're also dealing with history, so the two have to come together. And Dunn says if you actually add up all the evidence that we have, which actually becomes quite voluminous, you basically end up in the place, as a historian, you end up in the place of saying something happened on this Easter Sunday, because there's too much weird behavior from the disciples at the point and continuing to basically go with the argument that nothing happened, right? So Dunn would say, a scientist would say, you can't prove that he, you can't prove that he rose from the dead. And Dunn would say, no, that might be true, but the history gives you all of the evidence to believe something happened there. So you've got to decide. What you can almost say as a historian is you can be very certain that you would disagree with the claim that nothing happened. Okay. So
Right.
on one side, you've got, well, that can't be that. But on the other side, you've got, no, something's gone on there. Something's happened. There's too many pieces at play to suggest that. Now, you're never going to be able to prove the resurrection, right? And Paul makes that point as well. It's about faith. There's always going to be a faith component to it. But it's not the zero-sum game that we often hear where people go, dead people don't rise from the dead. That story's just made up. Well, actually, a bit of historical analysis would say something happened.
Right.
You can't just dismiss this as nothing. Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. And maybe, one last thought as we maybe start to kind of wrap up this conversation, because it's one that, well, we're going to have a few weeks on it, but
yes.
it could be multiple hours and still multiple weeks as well. It's easier in some senses, I would say, for us to look back like at prophetic, kind of references within the Old Testament to say, well, there's confirmation around, why we would see, it would be easier for us to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. But when you're looking specifically at the disciples, how much knowledge would they have had of those Old Testament references that we are privileged to in some senses, right? Because I know you'd have the first 5 books, at least most of them, but beyond that, and even if they knew them, I'm not sure they would have connected them necessarily as first,
No, I mean, yeah, it's a good question, I think, to ask. The impression that we get from early Judaism, from first century Judaism, we'd know as Second Temple Judaism would be its kind of official name historically, was that literacy levels were very high.
Right.
So I can't remember. I've read about this sort of supposed statistics somewhere, and I can't remember them just now. But because Second Temple Judaism was growing, the rabbinic influence was growing very, very heavily, right? So by the time that the temple is destroyed, the rabbis really are some of the most dominant force of Judaism, and because they had become a people of the book through rabbinic Judaism, the temple destruction, although hugely significant, didn't have the same impact this time when it got knocked kind of to pieces by the Romans, because the rabbis had kind of, by 70 AD, had kind of given up on what they felt was the corruption of the temple to become a people of the text. So one of the trade-offs that you get for becoming a people of the text is high levels of literacy amongst Jewish people, because the text is important. So we want you to read the text and understand the text and believe the text. Does that make sense? So you get this sort of sense of awareness. So I think you can postulate that the disciples were relatively biblically literate. That I think you can say that, right? I don't think you can prove it, but the evidence, the way that Jesus talks, the way that Paul talks is a classic example. These guys knew the texts, right? They seem to understand that. So where the disciples were on that, I think they would know it better than we would. Let's say that for definite. The other thing that's interesting for me, Tom Wright makes a lot of this, and I'm persuaded by it, is actually some of the apocryphal texts, particularly the Maccabean stories, are quite interesting, because the Maccabees definitely have an idea of resurrection. So the Maccabean stories are the stories of some of the uprisings that happened what we now call as Christians the intertestamental period, that time space between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And the Maccabean stories were hugely significant for the people around about Jesus' time. But so you would probably grow up hearing those stories. Hanukkah and all that sort of stuff originates from those stories. If you're growing up listening to those stories, like the Maccabean brothers went to their deaths believing in resurrection. They thought that God was going to bring them back on the last day. Another one for me that's quite interesting, I allude to this in one of the Sunday sessions on this series as well, is Martha's conversation with with Jesus in John 11. So you actually see a little bit of popular insight there. So when Jesus comes, Martha's mad at Jesus, fantastic story. With Jesus, they've all heard Lazarus is not well, and so they go to see him. Jesus takes ages to get there, unnecessarily it seems, and he's dead by the time Jesus arrives. So Martha gives Jesus a piece of her mind. Like, if you got here sooner, he wouldn't have died. And then Jesus starts to comment about resurrection. And can you remember Martha's response in John 11 is, well, I know that he will be raised on the last day, right? So I think that's a really interesting snapshot into popular level beliefs about resurrection. Oh, it's going to happen, but at some point, down the road sort of thing, not here and now. And the real shock for the New Testament writers isn't that resurrection is something that happens. I think they all believe that from their spectrum. It's that it happens now. And that, if you read Corinthians, that's what Paul really is blown away by.
Yeah, in the middle of history.
Yeah, in the middle, not the end of history.
Right.
So I think that the prophetic texts from the Old Testament would inform popular belief,
right?
But they wouldn't prove it to them, because the one thing that Paul has to sort of show, which is that big surprise, is that nobody expected, so Martha believed that Lazarus would be raised from the dead, but she thought that was going to be in a distant point in the future.
Right.
When Martha believed that Lazarus was going to be raised from the dead, Jesus says, hey, don't worry about resurrection, or don't worry about, him being raised. Martha thinks he's talking about future resurrection. She doesn't think Jesus is going to go, so let's go down to the tomb right now, okay? Now, to be clear, from a theological point of view, what Lazarus encounters isn't resurrection. He's just brought back to life, What happens to Jesus from the biblical theological point of view is he is raised into a new bodily existence. So
yes, because Lazarus died. Yeah, Lazarus dies again.
As far as we're led to believe,
unless he's somewhere, we don't know. I guess for sure, but.
So I think that would be my way. So the prophetic witness doesn't prove it to the disciples, because Jesus still modifies. So again, actually, just throw that into the list again. The disciples, if they're faking this, they choose resurrection rather than just spiritual existence. And the problem is they choose resurrection, but then they don't even choose it right. Okay, so they choose resurrection. Say, let's imagine them. Okay, like, what are we going to do about this? Let's pretend he was resurrected. Well, somebody's going to go, well, why would we pretend that? That's not happening for thousands of years yet. So they get their eschatology wrong if they're going to fake it as resurrection. So, which is why I think I find myself very comfortable with what Dunn says, that the storyline, they made it up, is problematic historically. It actually, in the end, and this is not going to lead you to faith. I think only the Holy Spirit does that. But in the end, I think it becomes harder to believe that nothing happened than it does to believe that something happened. And that's where I would stand on that, Tyson.
Yeah, and maybe that's where we wrap up for today. But this leads to all sorts of conversations that we'll maybe have to start looking at starting next week, even around, if resurrection is true, how is it shaped, or how is the Western world even shaped? Our thoughts around heaven and hell, that language, and
I might leave you to do that one by yourself.
If you don't show up next week to the call, I'll know exactly what's going on there. But it does start to lead to these questions. So that's something that we'll have to continue to wrestle.
I like it. Thanks so much, everybody, for being with us today. Appreciate it.